The morning of April 7th, 1945, in a forest clearing 30 kilometers southeast of Stettin, Hauptmann Klaus Richter stood before something he had spent the last 3 years trying to kill, a Boeing B-29 Superfortress. Not a photograph, not an intelligence sketch, not fragments pulled from a crash site. An intact aircraft, sitting on muddy ground, its polished aluminum skin reflecting the pale spring sunlight like a promise from another world. Richter was not a pilot. He was an engineer, one of the Luftwaffe's technical intelligence officers, trained to dissect enemy aircraft and extract their secrets. He had examined Lancasters, Liberators, Fortresses. He understood defensive armament the way a surgeon understands anatomy. He knew where bombers were vulnerable, where their guns could not reach, where a skilled fighter pilot could slip through the curtain of fire and deliver a killing blow. But standing here, looking at the B-29's belly turret through morning fog, he felt something he had not experienced since 1940: doubt. Because this was not just a bigger bomber. This was something his colleagues in the fighter divisions had never faced. Something that belonged to the Pacific War, to the distant battle against Japan, far beyond the reach of German interceptors. And now, through the chaos of the collapsing Eastern Front, through circumstances Richter only partially understood, one had fallen into German hands. What he was about to learn in the next 72 hours would answer a question that had haunted Luftwaffe planning since 1943. Why had the Americans never sent the B-29 to Europe? The answer was simpler and more terrifying than anyone had imagined. They hadn't needed to. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. To understand what Richter saw that April morning, we must first understand what the Luftwaffe had learned about killing bombers. By 1945, the air defense of Germany had become a science written in blood. Every tactic, every attack angle, every gun caliber had been tested against waves of American heavy bombers that arrived each day like clockwork, hundreds of aircraft turning the sky into a geometry problem solved by violence. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress had been the teacher. When the first B-17 seconds appeared over German airspace in 1942, Luftwaffe pilots attacked them with the same tactics they had used against British bombers. Stern chases, trying to shoot down the bomber from behind while staying out of the tail gunner's arc of fire. It was suicide. The B-17's tail guns, two 50 caliber Browning machine guns operated by a single gunner in an exposed position, could shred a Bf-109 at 400 meters. And while a fighter pilot maneuvered for position, trying to climb into the bomber's blind spot, the waist gunners would track him, the ball turret gunner would rotate his position, and suddenly the sky around his aircraft would fill with tracers converging from multiple angles. By the autumn of 1943, experienced German fighter pilots had calculated the mathematical truth of bomber defense. You could not dance with a B-17. You had to punch it in the face. Thus was born the frontal attack, the head-on pass that became the signature of Luftwaffe bomber interception. Fighter aircraft would climb above the bomber formation, position themselves ahead and above the lead aircraft, then dive down and through the formation at maximum speed, firing their 20mm and 30mm cannons in short, devastating bursts aimed at the cockpit and engines. The logic was brutal but sound. Attack from the front, where the B-17's defensive fire was weakest. The chin turret added to later models had limited traverse. The top turret could not depress far enough to engage an aircraft coming from 12 o'clock high. The waist gunners had no angle at all. For a brief window, perhaps 3 or 4 seconds, the attacking fighter faced only 2 or 3 guns instead of 10. It worked. German fighter pilots began downing B-17 seconds in significant numbers. On October 14, 1943, the second Schweinfurt raid, the Luftwaffe shot down 60 B-17 seconds out of a force of 291 aircraft. The Americans called it Black Thursday. The Germans called it a masterpiece of fighter tactics, but it came at a cost. Frontal attacks required closing to within 200 meters of a 4-engine bomber. then holding your course through an expanding cone of defensive fire while your own aircraft bucked from the recoil of your cannons. You aimed for the cockpit, a target less than 3 meters wide, while flying at a combined closing speed of over 800 kilometers per hour. If you fired too late, you missed. If you held the pass too long, the bomber's remaining guns bracketed you. If you misjudged the deflection angle, you simply flew into the bomber itself. German pilots developed a dark joke. There were two types of pilots who flew frontal attacks, those who had done it once and those who had done it twice. Because after twice, you were either dead or too shattered to fly anymore. And yet they adapted. They refined. By 1944, the Luftwaffe had organized specialized assault units Sturmgruppen, equipped with heavily armored for 190 seconds, bristling with cannon and armored glass. These aircraft absorbed punishment that would destroy a standard fighter, allowing pilots to close to 100 meters or less before firing. Some pilots, in moments of desperation or fury, simply rammed B-29 seconds, trading their lives for the certainty of the kill. The Americans adapted too. They added more guns. They improved their formations so that fields of fire overlapped, creating interlocking zones where no German fighter could enter, without facing simultaneous fire from multiple bombers. They flew with fighter escorts, Mustangs and Thunderbolts that stayed with the bomber stream all the way to the target and back, turning the sky over Germany into a three-dimensional battlefield. By late 1944, the Luftwaffe was losing. But they were losing to an enemy they understood. They knew the B-17's blind spots. They knew the B-24's vulnerabilities. Its high Davis wing made it more fragile than the Fortress, more prone to catastrophic fires. They knew that an experienced German pilot in a well-maintained fighter, with altitude advantage and surprise, could still win that duel. They knew the rules of the game. What Richter understood, standing in that forest clearing in April 1945, was that the B-29 played a different game entirely. The first thing Richter noticed was not the size, though the B-29 dwarfed every bomber he had ever examined. The wingspan, 43 meters, was wider than a Lancaster's. The fuselage stretched 30 meters from nose to tail, longer than some of the barracks where Luftwaffe ground crews slept. But size was expected. Intelligence reports had provided the dimensions. What reports could not convey what no photograph or technical drawing could prepare him for was the completeness of the design. The B-17 looked like what it was, a collection of defensive positions bolted onto a flying machine. Gun blisters protruded from the fuselage. The ball turret hung beneath the belly like a tumor. The tail gunner sat in an exposed position, separated from the rest of the crew, freezing in the slipstream. The B-29 looked like it had been designed by someone who understood that crew survivability was not a luxury but a requirement. The entire crew compartment from nose to tail was pressurized. The gunners did not sit at their guns, exposed to the -50-degree air at 10,000 meters. They sat at fire control stations inside the pressurized tunnel, looking through optical sights, controlling the turrets remotely. Richter walked slowly around the aircraft, his boots squelching in the mud, making notes in his leather field book. He counted the gun positions. 4 turrets. Upper forward, upper aft, lower forward, lower aft, plus the tail position. 12 50-caliber Browning machine guns total. The same number as a B-17, but arranged differently, controlled differently. Richter had brought with him Lieutenant Hans Fay, a test pilot from the Erprobungsstelle, the Luftwaffe's testing and evaluation center at Rechlin. Fay had flown captured Allied aircraft before, Spitfires, P-51 seconds, even a battered B-17 that had been patched together from 3 wrecks. He understood how the enemy thought, how their machines handled, what compromises they made between performance and safety. Fay circled the B-29 with the careful attention of a man examining a bomb. He ran his hand along the turret housing of the upper forward position, feeling the smoothness of the mechanism. He crouched beneath the lower forward turret, studying how it was mounted, how the guns articulated. Then he looked at Richter and said something that would appear in Richter's report 3 days later, preserved in the archives of American military intelligence after the war. This is not a defensive system. This is a mathematics problem with guns attached. What Fay meant, what became clear as they spent the next 3 days examining every aspect of the B-29's armament, was that the defensive system was not built around human gunners making rapid decisions under stress. It was built around a central fire control computer that calculated ballistic solutions and slaved the turrets to follow those solutions automatically. The implications were staggering. In a B-17, each gunner fought his own small battle. The top turret gunner tracked targets in his sector. The ball turret gunner covered the ventral approaches. The waist gunners handled beam attacks. They communicated by intercom, warned each other of threats, tried to coordinate their fire. But fundamentally, each man aimed his own guns, calculated his own lead, fired his own bursts. Human reaction time imposed limits. A gunner might see a fighter rolling in from 10 o'clock high, but by the time he rotated his turret, acquired the target, calculated lead, and fired, the fighter had already adjusted its approach or delivered its attack. Gun camera footage from German fighters showed this repeatedly. Tracers from bomber defensive guns streaming behind the attacking aircraft, always a fraction of a second too slow. The B-29 eliminated that lag. The gunner acquired the target through his optical sight, a sophisticated gun sight with range-finding capability. He centered the reticle on the target and pressed a thumb switch. The fire control computer, a General Electric analog system, using mechanical computation calculated range based on the optical input, measured the target's angular velocity, factored in the aircraft's speed and altitude, computed the ballistic trajectory of 50 caliber ammunition at that altitude and airspeed, calculated the lead angle, and transmitted electrical signals to the turret motors. The turrets rotated automatically, the guns elevated to the computed angle, and when the calculation was complete, all of this happening in less than 1 second, the guns fired. The gunner did not aim in the traditional sense. He designated the target. The machine did the killing. Richter and Fay spent hours inside the B-29's fuselage, studying the fire control stations. The upper forward gunner sat in a position behind the cockpit, looking through a transparent dome. His station controlled not only the upper forward turret 450 caliber guns, but also the lower forward turret 2 guns. 6 weapons, 1 trigger, centralized control. The mathematics became clear immediately. A German fighter making a frontal attack on a B-17 faced, at most, the chin turret's 2 guns. If the attack angle was correct, perhaps the top turret could depress enough to engage 2 more guns. 4 guns maximum, operated by 2 human gunners, making independent decisions. That same German fighter attacking a B-29 from the front would face 6 guns, all controlled by a single gunner through a computer that did not panic, did not fatigue, and did not miss the lead calculation. The German pilot's closing speed, his primary advantage in a frontal attack, became his greatest vulnerability. Because the faster he closed, the more accurately the fire control computer could predict his flight path. The computer did not need to see where the fighter was. It calculated where the fighter would be when the bullets arrived. Fay, reading through the technical manual they had recovered with the aircraft, a manual marked "restricted" in English, now translated hastily by a Luftwaffe intelligence officer who had studied engineering. Cambridge before the war found the specifications for the ballistic computer's accuracy. At a range of 400 meters, with a target closing at 600 kilometers per hour, the system's calculated error was less than 2 meters. 2 meters. A Bf-109's wingspan was 9.9 meters. A full 190's was 10.5 meters. The cone of fire from 650 caliber machine guns, all converging on a 2-meter circle, would not damage a fighter. It would disintegrate it. Fay did the calculation in his field notebook, his handwriting cramped and precise. 6 guns at 800 rounds per minute equals 4,800 rounds per minute combined. Divide by 60 to get rounds per second, 80 rounds per second. A frontal attack pass at maximum closing speed lasts approximately 3 seconds from effective range to breakaway. 80 times 3 equals 240 rounds. 240 50 caliber bullets, all aimed by a computer with appraise. 2-meter error circle. He showed the calculation to Richter. Richter looked at it for a long time. Then he wrote in his own notebook, "Frontal attack doctrine is obsolete against this aircraft." But it was worse than that, because the system covered not just frontal attacks, but every attack vector. The upper aft turret, controlled by a second gunner, covered high stern and beam, approaches the classic angle for German fighters trying to avoid head-on passes. The lower aft turret covered ventral approaches, eliminating the blind spot that B-17 ball turret gunners struggled to cover during high-G maneuvering. And the tail guns, 2 50 caliber weapons in a dedicated tail position, were controlled by their own fire control system, with their own computing site. A German pilot trying the traditional stern chase, sliding into the 6 o'clock position where he thought he faced only 2 guns operated by one man, would instead face 2 guns operated by a machine that calculated lead angle more accurately than any human gunner ever could. There was no safe approach vector, there was no blind spot, there was no window where a skilled pilot's reflexes and aggression could overcome the defensive system. There was only the question: how many hits could your fighter absorb before it ceased to function? And the answer, for every German fighter in service in 1945, was not enough. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. On the afternoon of April 8th, Richter requested permission to attempt a ground simulation of an attack pass. The B-29 was not flyable, it had been damaged during its emergency landing, and the Luftwaffe had no spare parts, no maintenance manuals, no ground crew trained on Wright Cyclone engines. But the defensive systems were intact. The electrical system could be powered by an external generator. The turrets could rotate. The guns, unloaded, could train on targets. Richter wanted to see what a German fighter pilot would face. They positioned a Foe 190 on the edge of the clearing, roughly 400 meters from the B-29. The Foe 190 was a wreck, cannibalized for parts, but its silhouette was correct. Fay, sitting in the upper forward gunner's position inside the B-29, acquired the target through his optical sight. He did not fire, there was no ammunition, and the guns were locked, but the system was active. When he centered the reticle on the WWII's cockpit and activated the tracking mode, the turrets rotated smoothly, hydraulics whining, until the gun barrels pointed not at where the WW190 was, but at where it would be if it were moving at attack speed. Richter stood next to the Foe 190, watching the turret track. The movement was faster than he expected. The upper forward turret 4 guns aligned on the fighter in less than 2 seconds. Then the lower forward turret rotated up, adding 2 more guns to the solution. 6 barrels, all aimed at a point in space approximately 20 meters ahead of the stationary FW190. 20 meters, the distance a fighter traveling at 600 kilometers per hour would cover in 0.12 seconds. The fire control system was leading to a stationary target. Richter moved to the side, simulating a beam attack angle. Fay, inside the B-29, acquired the new target position. The upper forward turret rotated 90 degrees, smooth as oil, tracking the movement. At certain angles, the upper aft turret also rotated, providing overlapping coverage. The system was designed so that multiple turrets could engage a single target, creating a kill zone where converging fire made evasion impossible. They repeated the simulation from different angles: high, low, stern, oblique. At every position, the turrets tracked faster than Richter could move. The system's response time was limited not by human reaction speed but by mechanical traverse rates. And those rates were adequate for any attack angle a German fighter could realistically achieve. That evening, Richter wrote the draft of his report. The language was technical, careful, stripped of emotion, but certain sentences would later be underlined by American intelligence officers reading captured German documents. The defensive fire control system represents a fundamental shift in bomber defense philosophy. German fighter tactics developed against B-17 and B-24 aircraft assume human reaction times and manual gun laying. These assumptions are invalid against the B-29. Recommend immediate review of all interception doctrine if this aircraft type is encountered in the European theatre. The report would never be finished. 8 days later, Soviet forces would overrun the area, and Richter's unit would retreat westward, destroying documents as they fled. The B-29 inches, the forest clearing, would be captured by Soviet troops, disassembled, and shipped to Moscow, where it would join the other captured superfortresses being reverse-engineered by Tupolev's design bureau. But the knowledge Richter gained in those 3 days would survive, because he was not the only one learning these lessons. In the Pacific, these lessons were being written in blood. While Richter examined the B-29's defensive systems in a muddy German forest, thousands of kilometers away, Japanese fighter pilots were learning the same truths through experience that would kill most of them. The XXI Bomber Command began operations from the Mariana Islands in November 1944. The first mission, a strike against the Nakajima aircraft factory near Tokyo on November 24th, involved 111 B-29 seconds. It was a test, a demonstration, a declaration that Japan's home islands were now within reach of American heavy bombers. Japanese fighter units scrambled to intercept. They flew with confidence born of 3 years fighting against older American bombers. They knew how to attack. B-17 seconds, which occasionally appeared in the Pacific. They understood defensive fire patterns. They had doctrine, experience, and courage. What they did not have was time to adapt. Flight Warrant Officer Isamu Sasaki, flying a Nakajima Ki-84 Frank fighter with the 47th Sentai, described his first encounter with a B-29 formation in a post-war interview recorded by American occupation authorities in 1946. The interview transcript, now preserved in the National Archives, provides one of the few detailed Japanese accounts of what it felt like to attack a superfortress. We climbed to 8,000 meters, which took almost 20 minutes. The B-29 seconds were above us, at 9,000 meters, perhaps higher. They looked like silver fish, moving slowly across the sky. I had seen B-17 seconds before, over Rabaul. These looked similar, large, 4 engines, the same American design. I thought it would be the same kind of fight. I chose my target, a bomber in the second element, slightly, separated from the others. I rolled into a diving attack from the right side, building speed. My plan was to make a high-side pass, attacking the engines and wing route, then break down and away before the gunners could track me effectively. This was standard doctrine. It had worked before. At 600 meters, I opened fire with my cannon. I saw my tracers going toward the bomber. Then the sky turned white, not tracers arcing past me, not individual streams of fire I could see and avoid. A solid wall of light, so dense I could not see the bomber anymore. White tracer fire and smoke. I felt the impact immediately. Something hit my canopy and cracked the glass on the left side. Something else hit my left wing. I heard the bang, felt the aircraft shudder. My controls became heavy. The aileron response was wrong. I broke away, diving, and only then did I realize I had been in the line of fire for perhaps 3 seconds. Maybe less. When I landed, the ground crew counted 11 holes in my aircraft. 7 in the left wing, 3 in the fuselage, 1 that had penetrated the canopy and exited through the upper cowling, missing my head by perhaps 20 centimeters. The bomber I attacked? I do not know if I hit it at all. I was too busy surviving. Sasaki flew 17 more missions against B-29 seconds before the war ended. He was shot down twice, once bailing out with severe wounds, once crash-landing with his aircraft on fire. He survived. Most of his squadron did not. The mathematics of B-29 defensive fire were not theoretical in the Pacific. They were measured in destroyed Japanese fighters and traumatized survivors. The March 9th to 10th, 1945, firebombing of Tokyo provides the starkest example. 334 B-29 seconds attacked at low altitude below 3,000 meters, carrying incendiary bombs instead of high explosives. The low altitude was deliberate. It increased bombing accuracy and reduced fuel consumption, allowing the bombers to carry more ordnance. It also brought the B-29 seconds within easier reach of Japanese fighters. Every available fighter unit in the Tokyo area scrambled. The Japanese Army Air Force and Naval Air Force put aside their usual coordination problems and threw everything they had at the bomber stream. Historians estimate between 200 and 250 Japanese fighters engaged the B-29 seconds during the raid. The B-29 seconds lost 14 aircraft. Most went down due to engine fires. The low-altitude approach increased engine stress, and several bombers suffered mechanical failures. Some were hit by anti-aircraft fire. A small number were destroyed by ramming attacks, Japanese pilots deliberately flying their fighters into the bombers when ammunition ran out. But Japanese losses were catastrophic. Official records are incomplete: the chaos of the raid, the firestorm consuming Tokyo below, the collapse of Japanese record-keeping systems as the war entered its final months, but conservative estimates place Japanese fighter losses at over 100 aircraft. Some historians suggest the actual number was closer to 130. 130 fighters destroyed. Against 14 bombers. The kill ratio 9 Japanese fighters lost for every B-29 destroyed was unsustainable. And it was not an anomaly. Similar ratios appeared in raid after raid throughout the spring of 1945. What had happened? Japanese pilots were doing everything their doctrine required. They attacked aggressively. They pressed close to effective cannon range. They aimed for vulnerable points, cockpits, engines, wing routes, and the B-29 seconds simply erased them from the sky. Lieutenant Junior Grade Minoru Suzuki, a Naval Air Force pilot flying an A6M50 from Atsugi Air Base, survived 4 encounters with B-29 formations before being shot down on May 25, 1945. He survived the war and was interviewed in 1948 by American researchers documenting Japanese air combat experiences. His testimony describes the moment when Japanese pilots realized they were not fighting bombers in any traditional sense. After my second mission, I spoke with the other surviving pilots. We compared our experiences. We all described the same thing. The defensive fire was not like fighting other bombers. It was like flying into a cloud of metal. You could not see individual tracers to dodge between them. You could not identify which gun was firing at you. The fire simply appeared all around you, and you either flew through it and survived by chance, or you did not. One of the older pilots, a veteran who had fought in China and over Rabaul, said something I will never forget. He said, "This is not gunnery. This is mathematics. They have calculated how to fill a piece of sky with bullets, and we are flying into that calculation." He was killed on the next mission. His aircraft was hit so many times they could not determine which to hit was fatal. The wreckage, when we recovered it, looked like it had been put through a shredding machine. The fear Japanese pilots developed toward B-29 seconds was different from the fear experienced by German pilots facing Allied bombers over Europe. German pilots feared the numbers, the escorts, the attrition. But they understood the fight. They knew that with skill, aggression, and luck, they could win the individual duel. Japanese pilots came to understand that there was no duel, there was only the decision. Do you press the attack and accept probable death, or do you break away and fail your duty? By May 1945, Japanese fighter effectiveness against B-29 formations had collapsed. Not because pilots lacked courage, The proliferation of ramming attacks demonstrates their willingness to die. But because courage without survivability creates only casualties, not victories. The Japanese Army Air Force began training special attack units specifically for anti-B-29 operations. These units, officially designated as Sentoki Tai or tactical fighter units, but functioning as kamikaze squadrons, were ordered to ram B-29 seconds when conventional attacks failed. The pilots were volunteers, in the same sense that all Japanese pilots in the final months of the war were volunteers. They volunteered, or they were transferred to ground units. Between March and August 1945, approximately 200 Japanese fighters deliberately rammed B-29 seconds over Japan. These attacks destroyed an estimated 37 B-29 seconds, a kill ratio of roughly 5 attackers per bomber destroyed. Even suicide attacks had become inefficient. The reason was the same mathematics that Richter had calculated in his German forest clearing. The B-29's defensive fire control system created kill zones that were simply too dense for aircraft to penetrate reliably, even when the pilot had no intention of surviving. A ramming attack required closing to zero distance. To reach zero distance, the pilot had to fly through the fire control computer's calculated intercept point, the exact piece of sky where 12 50 caliber machine guns converged their fire. Some pilots made it through. Most did not. Staff Sergeant Isamu Kashiide, a B-29 tail gunner with the 500th Bombardment Group, recorded his experience during a mission over Osaka on June 1, 1945, in a letter home that was preserved in his personal papers. "We were on the bomb run when the tail lookout called out a fighter coming in fast from 6 o'clock level. I was already tracking another fighter that had made a pass and was breaking away, but I swung my sight back to acquire the new target. It was a zero, coming straight in, no deviation, no evasion, just pointing at us like an arrow. I centered the reticle and activated the tracking system. The computed sight showed range decreasing 800 yards, 700, 600. I pressed the firing button at 500 yards. The zero came apart. I do not mean it was hit and started smoking. I mean it disintegrated. The engine separated from the fuselage. The wings folded up. Pieces flew everywhere. It happened so fast I thought maybe he had dropped a bomb that detonated prematurely. But it was just the guns. My guns, 2 50 caliber Brownings in the tail turret, controlled by the GE fire control system. 2 guns did that. I do not know if that pilot intended to ram us or if he was trying to make a conventional attack. It does not matter. He flew through the calculated intercept point, and the system simply removed him from existence. I have thought about that a lot since coming home, about what it must have looked like from his perspective. One moment you are flying toward your target, committed to the attack. The next moment, nothing. Too fast for pain, too fast even for fear. I used to think being a tail gunner was about having quick reflexes and steady hands. Now I know it is about letting a machine make decisions faster than a human brain can process them. Kashiide flew 31 missions over Japan. He was credited with 4 confirmed kills and 3 probable. He never fired his guns in manual mode. Every engagement was through the computed sight. Every trigger press was a command to the fire control system to execute a ballistic solution. He returned home to Michigan in October 1945 and never flew again. The psychological weight of what the B-29's defensive system represented was not lost on American crews either. They understood, perhaps better than the engineers who designed it, that they were no longer warriors in a traditional sense. They were operators of a machine that killed with industrial efficiency. Technical Sergeant Robert Morgan, an upper forward gunner with the 73rd Bombardment Wing, wrote in his diary after a mission over Tokyo in April 1945, "Shot down 3 fighters today. I say I, but that is not accurate. The system shot them down. I identified targets. I activated tracking. I pressed buttons. The machine did the killing." It is strange to think that in a war where so much depends on individual courage and skill, my job is to be a component in a mechanism. The bomb site operator inputs target coordinates. The navigator inputs wind speed and direction. I input target acquisition. The machine processes all of this and determines what happens next. We are told this makes us more effective. And it is true our loss rates are far lower than B-17 crews experienced over Europe. We are surviving. But I wonder sometimes what we are becoming. What kind of war this is, where the killing is done by mathematics. Morgan survived the war and later wrote that his most disturbing memory was not the combat, the flak, or the fear. It was the efficiency. The way the system reduced aerial combat, which had always been portrayed as a contest between skilled opponents, into a problem of geometry and ballistics that computers could solve faster and more accurately than any human. The B-29 was not just a better bomber. It was the beginning of something larger, the industrialization not just of production, but of killing itself, the automation of violence, the removal of human judgment from the trigger. This was the future that Klaus Richter had glimpsed in that forest clearing in Germany. This was what he understood when he examined the fire control stations and calculated the fields of overlapping fire. The age where individual skill mattered, where the ace pilot, the expert gunner, the veteran warrior could shape the outcome of battles was ending. It was being replaced by systems, by engineering, by machines that calculated optimal solutions to the problem of destroying other machines, with humans reduced to input devices and target designators. And there was no defense against it, except to build better systems. The Japanese tried. In the final months of the war, they developed the Nakajima Ki-87, a high-altitude interceptor specifically designed to engage B-29 seconds at maximum operating altitude, where the thinner air might reduce the effective range of defensive guns. Only one prototype flew before the war ended. They experimented with heavy cannon 30mm, even 40mm weapons, trying to engage B-29 seconds from beyond the effective range of 50 caliber fire. But heavier cannons meant lower rates of fire, and slower rates of fire meant fewer chances to hit a target that was increasingly difficult to approach. They tried coordination, multiple fighters attacking simultaneously from different vectors, trying to overwhelm the fire control system's ability to prioritize targets. Sometimes it worked. Usually it just meant more fighters entering the kill zone at the same time, and the B-29's ability to slave multiple turrets to a single gunner meant that simultaneous attacks often faced simultaneous defensive fire. Nothing worked consistently, nothing reduced the casualty rates to sustainable levels. By August 1945, the 509th Composite Group dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki from B-29 seconds that flew with minimal defensive armament, most of the gun turrets removed to save weight for the bombs. The aircraft flew alone, unescorted, relying on speed and altitude rather than defensive firepower. The Japanese sent no fighters to intercept them, not because they lacked the capability, but because by that point, Japanese air defense had been so thoroughly attrited by months of fighting B-29 seconds that organized interception was no longer possible. The fighter units were gone, the pilots were dead, the infrastructure was destroyed. The B-29 had not just won the tactical battle, it had won the strategic war of attrition, destroying the enemy's ability to contest airspace through sheer mechanical superiority. This was the revelation that would haunt Richter and Fay and every other German aviation expert who examined the B-29's systems in those final days of the European war. Germany had never faced the B-29's combat. But if they had, if the Americans had deployed superfortresses to Europe instead of keeping them in the Pacific, the Luftwaffe would have experienced the same learning curve as the Japanese, compressed into weeks instead of months. Every tactic the Germans had perfected against B-17 seconds and B-24 seconds would have failed. The frontal attacks would have become mass suicide. The skilled veteran pilots who had survived hundreds of missions would have died in their first encounters with the fire control systems. The carefully calculated blind spots and approach angles would have vanished, replaced by overlapping fields of computer-directed fire, and there would have been no time to adapt. No time to develop new tactics, new aircraft, new weapons. Because while German engineers were figuring out the problem, hundreds of B-29 seconds would have been systematically destroying every factory, every refinery, every rail yard in Germany with the same mechanical efficiency their defensive systems used to destroy fighters. The war would have ended sooner, not because of dramatic battles or heroic sacrifices, but because the mathematics would have made resistance pointless. In his final report, the one he never finished, but whose fragments were recovered by American forces from partially destroyed German files, Klaus Richter wrote, "If the question is, why did the Americans not send the B-29 to Europe, the answer may be simple. They did not need to. The B-17 and B-24 were sufficient for the strategic bombing campaign. The B-29 was held in reserve for the Pacific, where distances required longer range and where Japanese fighter opposition required superior defensive systems. But if the question is, could Germany have defended against the B-29 if it had been deployed here? The answer is no. Not with current fighter designs, not with current tactics, not with any foreseeable development of existing technologies. This aircraft represents a paradigm shift in strategic bombing. It is not an incremental improvement, but a fundamental rethinking of what a bomber should be. The defensive system alone invalidates years of German fighter doctrine. If there is a lesson for future conflict, it is this. Individual courage and skill are becoming obsolete as decisive factors in aerial combat. They are being replaced by systems engineering, by integrated fire control, by machines that calculate faster than humans can think. The pilot and gunner of the future will not be warriors in the traditional sense. They will be operators of automated systems, technicians who input target data and monitor computer solutions. War is becoming an engineering problem, and we are living in the last days when that was not yet true. Richter surrendered to American forces on May 7, 1945. He was interrogated by U.S. Army Air Force's intelligence officers at a facility in Wiesbaden, where his examination of the B-29 earned him a transfer to Wright Field in Ohio. He spent 6 months there, consulting on German aviation technology, before returning to Germany in 1946. He never flew again. He worked as a civilian aviation engineer for Messerschmitt during the Reconstruction, then for Dornier, then retired in 1972. In a 1983 interview with a German aviation historian, Richter was asked if he had any regrets about his wartime service. He said, "I regret many things about the war, but examining that B-29 inches April 1945, no, because it taught me something essential about the world that was coming. It taught me that technology was replacing humanity at the center of warfare, that the future would belong not to the bravest or most skillful, but to whoever had the better machines and better systems. Some people found that comforting after the war, the idea that wars could be won by engineering rather than by sending millions of men to die in trenches or in burning aircraft. But I found it terrifying, because machines do not question orders. They do not feel doubt. They do not see the humanity of their targets. The B-29's fire control system did not see Japanese pilots. It saw ballistic problems to be solved, and it solved them with perfect efficiency. That is the world we are living in now, and it started with 12 50-caliber machine guns controlled by a computer that never missed. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.